If I were to make a list of the most significant events in the last 500 years, the American Revolution would be right there around the top. And what's so interesting is that the catalyst for the American Revolution was tea. That's right, today we're gonna go deep into the history of the Boston Tea Party. To understand the significance of this, you need to realize that the American Revolution wasn't just about freeing a colony. It gave rise to a completely new form of government, social values, and in some ways what it actually means to be a free nation. The American Revolution also inspired similar revolutionary movements around the world. Just take the French Revolution for example, where the American Revolution set the stage. And the massive American economy that came as a result of the American Revolution also played a key role in determining the outcome of 2 world wars, the outcome of which shaped the world that we know today. So it's safe to say that without the American Revolution, the world that we know today would look very, very different. So what is the Boston Tea Party? You see, prior to the American Revolution, people were getting really frustrated by rising taxes. At one point, a group of men boarded an East India Company ship and threw its tea cargo overboard. And that's the act that we know today as the Boston Tea Party. And this would trigger a sequence of events that would eventually culminate in the American Revolution. So the question is, how did the Tea Party even come to be? By the way, in case you're new here, this is History Meets Finance, a channel where every week we post interesting stories about the history of money, so subscribe if you haven't already. But for now, let's talk about the details of the Boston Tea Party. You see, leading up to the Boston Tea Party, there were many reasons for the colonists to resent their British overlords. In order to protect the interests of the powerful East India Company, the British Crown at that time passed various laws in 13 of their colonies. And this was done pretty carelessly. These included taxes that were being levied as part of the Townshend Act. And one of the nuances for this that is relevant to us is that the colonies could only import tea sold by the East India Company. While some of these new taxes would later be repealed because of rising colonial discontent, one of the taxes stayed on, and that was the tea tax. Now let me be clear, it wasn't the tax itself that the colonists resented. Rather, it was the taxation without representation that really irritated them, because the Americans didn't have any say in the matter. Now they were British subjects, but they saw the Crown's arbitrary taxation as a clear violation of the country's constitution. It's not like they couldn't afford the tax, it was just the principle of the matter. Specifically, this was having the right to be not taxed without the consent of their elected representatives. I mean, even the East India Company officials would later advise the Crown to repeal this tea tax. However, the government still kept it in place, just to remind the colonists that they have the right to tax Americans. The monopoly enjoyed by the East India Company and the fact that the British government was unwilling to see the colonists as subjects with equal rights, all this stuff drove resentment amongst the local politicians and merchants, even the conservative colonial merchants. Eventually, protests started to begin, and that was led by the Whigs, which was the conservative party back then. And these protests were a movement against what they called a tyranny of the Crown. In almost every American colony, people who were participating in the protests were calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, and they started preventing ships from unloading their tea cargo at their ports. But this wasn't the case everywhere. In Boston, for example, the governor, Thomas Hutchinson, was determined to uphold the existing law. During one of the shipments, there were 3 merchant ships scheduled to arrive. These ships were called the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, and Governor Hutchinson intervened to make sure that the tea got unloaded and that the duties were duly paid. However, unknown to him, around that time, there were thousands of protesters secretly gathering at the Old South Meeting House, which were near the wharves at the time, and they were calling for drastic action. Things were about to very quickly heat up. Now you can probably just imagine the royal governor smugly looking at the port, enjoying his evening tea at a job well done. And then he sees some 60 men, some of them dressed as Mohawk warriors, forcefully boarding these 3 ships. And once they take over, they dump their cargo, all 342 chests of tea, into the water. This act was cleverly referred to as a party, the Boston Tea Party. Now during these attacks, dressing up as Mohawk warriors was actually intended to be a very symbolic choice. It showed that the Sons of Liberty protesters identified with America, as opposed to the subjects of Great Britain. But if you think about this historic gesture didn't really age well given the historic atrocities of the new settlers in America. But we digress. We're going to explore that in another video. In any case, the damages that were caused to those ships amounted to about 18,000 pounds in property damage around that time, equal to about 3.5 million pounds in today's value. But the Tea Party wasn't over just yet. Later on, the Sons of Liberty would learn that another ship successfully managed to unload its tea cargo at a warehouse, and that warehouse would eventually be located and everything inside of it would be destroyed. And when they learned that some of it had been sold to a shop, they broke into that shop and threw all the tea out. A clear message had been sent to the British government. Now, this single act set a chain for everything that was about to follow. The Boston Tea Party was heavily publicized, and a distinct American identity began to emerge. The American identity in all of this was solidified given the heavy-handed response of the British government that followed the event. The British government passed the Intolerable Acts into law, which aimed to punish the Massachusetts colonists for their defiance during the Tea Party protests. They were stripped of many of their rights and liberties, including self-governance. At that time, many prominent colonists like Benjamin Franklin actually came forward to pay for the damages sustained by the East India Company. However, most Americans at that time did not think that the British government saw them as equals. What happened in Massachusetts could happen in any other state. Doubling down on the Americans did not help. Instead of weakening the American defiance of British authority, as the Crown had hoped, these stricter laws just angered the Americans and inflamed the whole situation further. Soon, similar acts to the Boston Tea Party would eventually be carried out, and this would lead to many American intellectuals and politicians discussing a possible independence from Great Britain. The seeds of the American Revolution were starting to sow, and we'd start seeing the revolution taking place just 2 years later. The Boston Tea Party certainly remains a pivotal moment in history. Its significance continues to resonate through modern society. Through their symbolic and bold acts, the colonists laid the groundwork for the American Revolution and the eventual formation of the United States. The event also serves as an example of how collective action by ordinary citizens in pursuit of their rights can truly lead to incredible history-changing results. This video was almost an example of too much government influence and coercion, but what happens when there's a massive financial bubble in a country and the government just doesn't take any action? That's what we see over in Europe with the Dutch tulip mania. I made a video about that, so check that out here, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on the next one.